All right there, everyone. Russia is considering taking in up to 15,000 white South African farmers as their own nation begins to plunge into dangerous and violent tribalism. That's what we'll be talking about on today's video. I'm not sure how many of you have been following this development coming out of Russia and South Africa. It's very, very interesting, if not, of course, a bit tragic here. Just a bit of background information. One of the latest moves by the South African Parliament was a recent vote in favor of a motion that will begin the process of amending the nation's constitution to allow for the confiscation of white-owned land without any compensation to the farmers and the landowners. And the measure was passed through the influence of the black Marxist leader Julius Malema, who's risen up as a serious presidential contender for the next national election. Malema is a radical leftist populist who's also a racial nationalist, and he's been calling for the expropriation of white-owned farmland to be returned, as he puts it, to black Africans. But he's advocated violence against white farmers. I mean, his racial rhetoric is pretty scary stuff. If you go on YouTube and do a search, you'll hear some pretty horrible words coming from his microphone. He was reported to have said that he was not calling for the slaughter of white people, at least not for now. I mean, this is scary stuff. So, needless to say, violence is in fact being directed more and more towards white farmers as symbols of South Africa's apartheid legacy. We have statistics that indicate that white farmers are 4 times as likely to become victims of violence than your average South African citizen. There were over 400 farm attacks during last year alone. That's more than 1 per day. Which is 4 times the number recorded just a decade ago. In 2018, figures are already expected to top last year's. Now, globally speaking, 2 nations have risen up and taken the lead here in terms of not just bringing awareness to this really horrific racial injustice, but also providing asylum for the farmers and their families. And those 2 nations would be Australia and Russia. Now, Australia was the first to come to the aid of these farmers by opening up its nation to them and expediting their immigration requirements. And many of these farmers have indeed accepted the invitation. And what's so revealing about all of this is that the population of white South African expats and immigrants is so high in Australia that it's led one member of parliament to compare the plight of white South Africans to that of the Syrians in their civil war. It's really comparably serious. Well, now Russia's coming to the aid of these farmers. It's been reported that Russia is, in fact, considering the offer of farmland to the south of Russia for upwards of 15,000 South African farmers. The farmland, as I understand it, is in Stavropol, which is just above the Republic of Georgia. Interestingly enough, a number of South African farmers have already settled there in the Republic of Georgia over the years due to this crisis. Already a delegation of Boers, or these white South African farmers, have come out to visit Russia. The plan seems to be that they'll start with migrating 30 families over to the Stavropol and begin the process of preparing for far greater numbers in the very near future. Now, of course, both Russia and South Africa share a lot in common. They both have European roots. They're both Christian. They're both agrarian and agricultural. And so even though certainly the language difference is going to be a significant hurdle for the settlers, Russia does offer nevertheless a very accommodating culture for them. But these similarities underscore, I think, a more fundamental development that's going on here, and that's the ways in which the nationalist, populist, and traditional sentiments that we see rising all over the place are creating new transnational solidarities and alliances. We, of course, have been seeing this in Europe with the rise of the Visegrad Four. We're seeing a comparable partnership developing between Italy, nationalist Italy, and nationalist Austria. We're actually just seeing a very successful summit between Viktor Orban of Hungary and Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu in Israel, where nationalist Hungary and ultra-nationalist Israel are forging very, very strong economic and strategic bonds. And of course, We're seeing the attempt of a new nationalist populist alliance between Russia and the United States. If the corporatist media and the Cold War infatuated deep state will ever get out of the way, which I think they will, and that progressively they're being consigned more and more to irrelevance, particularly the mainstream media. And in the midst of all of this, we're seeing nations like Russia and Australia develop alliances of solidarity with South African farmers. What's so interesting here is the way in which Russia and Australia are similar in terms of their relationship to their respective nationalist right parties and policies. Both nations have been able to rather seamlessly absorb nationalist values into their mainstream politics. And so needless to say, the plight of white farmers in South Africa has not been left to the racial concerns of the nationalist right or the alt-right for that matter. There's certainly, of course, concern with that, those groups, that is. But because nationalist populist sentiments have weaved their way into the political mainstream in both Russia and Australia, more so in Russia, of course. Australia still has very hardcore secular left power base, whereas Russia's left wing has basically been decimated, as it has in Central and Eastern Europe. But both Russia and Australia are showing the promise of the kinds of solidarity and allegiances that can be forged in an era of nationalism, populism, and traditionalism. And this is very important, a very important development. Let's be clear here. Secular globalists don't give a rip about the plight of white farmers in South Africa. Remember, for them, for secular globalists, South Africa represents the triumph, the jewel of the idealism of human rights and liberal democracy and social justice, and the optimism and promise that these ideals hold for a peaceful and inclusive world. And so you'll be hard-pressed to find a single globalist elite showing a shred of concern for these white farmers. Indeed, I even read one writing for the ultra-liberal British paper The Guardian, who just flat out denied that there is anything to be concerned about in South Africa. And he just went on to blame the racist alt-right for drumming up an artificial conspiracy and crisis. But when all is said and done, this is only because globalists like this writer refuse to recognize that this globalist triumph in South Africa is, to put it rather bluntly, completely and totally collapsing. Like globalism itself, it's utterly falling apart. As it turns out, nation, culture, tradition, language, land, yes, race, they matter. They really do matter to populations. And the whole attempt at trying to do social order apart from them in this globalist experiment is falling apart. It's collapsing to good old-fashioned tribalism, quite literally all over the world, and most especially in South Africa right now as we speak. So these farmers are not going to find anyone in the globalist mindset willing to help them out here. But they are finding that nationalists and populists and their political allies are certainly willing to help them. They do understand the nature of culture, custom, tradition, land, and ethnicity, and the role these things play in a national population. They see South Africa degenerating into tribalist rot. They see it. And so Russia and Australia are most certainly reaching out and offering to provide sanctuary to these farmers as part of a world that's being reconfigured around national populist alliances and sentiments. So we'll certainly be keeping our eyes on how things develop in South Africa and the offers of sanctuary in places like Russia and Australia. As always, please like, comment, and subscribe. Click on our Patreon link below. Become a monthly supporter of this channel and help us to continue to analyze current events in light of awesome conservative trends so that you can personally and professionally flourish.